Good evening and welcome to Hemispheres. My name's Richard Curtis. I'll be your host of this evening. And Guy was helpfully reminding me that it's actually May now. And so the more important information about the video I was telling you about earlier is that there will be more screenings, and you can call for information about that. The number is 443-8252. This evening we're going to be discussing the re-release of the Communist Manifesto on its 150th anniversary, today being the 180th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx. To get things going, we have a little bit of music. Traditional socialist anthem, The Red Flag, a version by the British artist Billy Bragg.
The people's flag is deepest red, it shrouded off the martyred dead. And ere the limbs grew stiff and cold, their hearts' blood died in every fold. Then raised the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It waves above our infant night, when all our heads seem dark as night. It witnessed many a deed and vow, we mustn't change its colour now. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It well recalls the triumphs past, it gives the hope of peace at last. The banner bright, the symbol plain of human right and human gain. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live or die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. His minds are fixed on health and place. To cringe beneath the rich man's frown and haul that sacred emblem down. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. With heads uncovered, swear we all to bear it on board till we fall. Come dungeons dark or gallows grim, this song shall be our parting hymn. Raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here.
And welcome to Hemispheres. That was Billy Bragg with The Red Flag. Joining me in the studio this evening, do want to extend a special greeting to all of our internet listeners out there and all of you listening in from afar. Joining me in the studio this evening, I have Professor David Hawkins, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, and Dr. Tom Mayer, Professor of Sociology. Welcome, gentlemen. I think I ought to turn your mics up. Let's try that again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. We wanted to take some time this evening to talk about the fact that Verso Press has saw fit to re-release the Communist Manifesto, and thinking that there may be something going on with the Communist Manifesto, and that these two gentlemen are in a unique position to offer us a little insight. And we might start with Tom.
Thank you, Richard. I thought I might begin by summarizing for listeners some of the main ideas of the Communist Manifesto and why the manifesto is still today a powerful document. I think the leading idea is perhaps the idea that the economic organization of society is the foundation on which all other social institutions rest, and that class struggle is the key to explaining history. Class struggle isn't the only thing that's happened in history, but it's the key to explaining why things have happened. And I think particularly important is the notion, which is throughout the manifesto, that capitalism is not a permanent system, but is something that will be transformed as a result of class struggle into a very different kind of social and economic system. And the key force in transforming capitalism will be the working class. Therefore, the working class should unite and make a common effort to overthrow capitalism. Racial, national, and gender differences are not important and should be overcome within the working class. Now, why is the manifesto such a powerful document? There are many reasons, but let me give three in particular. First of all, the manifesto gives the reader great confidence that capitalism will, in fact, be overthrown. It contains numerous penetrating insights about historical processes, which increase the credibility of that analysis to a large extent. And finally, the manifesto is clearly a literary masterpiece. It has amazingly succinct formulations about many complex ideas and numerous memorable phrases which have gone into the common jargon and are often quoted. Those are three reasons why, although it's 150 years old today, the manifesto is still a very powerful and very modern-sounding document. David, you want to make some comments?
Yes, thanks. I've been fascinated to reread the manifesto after not having read it for many years, because it has this rather timeless quality. I've been told, and I think it must be true, that next to the Holy Bible, this book has been more widely read than any other book in print over the last 150 years at least. And I think that one of the reasons for it is that it does give a succinct, perhaps oversimplified, picture of human history. Karl Marx was a student of Hegel, the great German philosopher, but Hegel's view of human history was that it was the development of thought, the development of idea, as he called it. And Marx said he turned Hegel upside down, put him on his feet again. And the feet were, of course, that the big development in human history was the development of the productive forces of human beings, their capacity to produce the things that they needed for survival and for growth, and the corresponding relations of production, which were the kinds of social organization that made this possible. All of the history of society since primitive times, we make an exception about primitive societies, were based on class struggle. That's the opening sentence in the manifesto. The aristocrats of ancient cities dominated the populace, enslaved them, or reduced them to conditions of serfdom. In the Middle Ages, the feudal system likewise reduced most of the population to conditions of serfdom. Capitalism beginning perhaps in the 18th century, beginning to grow strongly in the 18th century, having a marked acceleration with things like the invention of the steam engine around 1800. This now is in the middle of the 1800s, only 50 years after that burgeoning growth, and Marx and Engels already are overwhelmed by the impression they have of its expansion, of its tremendous economic productivity. And contrary to what many people think of the socialists, Marx and Engels loved capitalism in a certain way, and the reason was that it was the first mode of human productive activity that produced genuine surplus, that made possible the expansion of the means of livelihood of human beings. And that was a great achievement. They also made some rather unkind remarks about the fact that the capitalists did this by exploiting large numbers of workers, and that was the basis of their antagonism to the system. But it was a combination of attitudes. It was a love-hate relation. When the Manifesto was written, Marx had begun his economic investigations some time before, reading the work in particular of the English stockbroker David Ricardo. But Marx's work in the following half-century, well, beyond the time of his death, his work was still being edited, was really a very major contribution to economic theory, and provided retrospectively the basis for some of their predictions about the downfall of capitalism. Mainly, the argument was, and it's a very considered argument, supported incidentally by John Maynard Keynes in some of his writing, that as time goes on, the rate of profit will, of necessity, diminish, and the share going to labor will decrease, which will impoverish, sooner or later, will lead to the impoverishment of labor. And sooner or later, therefore, the income of human beings will have to depend more and more on sources other than their labor power. And when you have a society that no longer feeds people in proportion to their earnings, then you have something called socialism. And this is a long-term perspective that comes out of Marx's view, not very much dependent on the events of a particular day or a particular decade. Sort of a very long-term projection. And many economists have discussed this. So it's not an ancient and not just a 19th century view of things. And I'll stop now. I'd like to come back and say something about the word communism at some point, but perhaps you'd like to
Sure.
chime in at this point.
I guess I'd like to say some more things about why I think the Manifesto remains highly relevant in 1998. You know, one of the opening phrases of the Manifesto is that a specter is haunting capitalism. And there still is a specter haunting capitalism, and that is the specter of the possibility of capitalist demise. That is a specter which is very much haunting the world, just as it did 150 years ago. We still have the tension, which I think David mentioned, between the immense productive power of capitalism on the one hand and its destructive social and environmental consequences on the other. That tension, that contradiction, is very much present throughout the Manifesto and is one of the things which gives us its great dramatic force. Moreover, I think that the reasons which Marx and Engels gave for the vulnerability of capitalism are still the critical ones today. Let me review some of them. Inequality. Capitalism produces immense inequality and permanent inequality, both between classes and between geographic regions of the world. We have seen in the 150 years since the Manifesto that this process of production of inequality has remained very much in force. Insecurity. That's another thing which Marx mentions in the Manifesto. Capitalism, for all its productive power, creates a continual insecurity for most of the population. They never feel really secure and stable in their situation in society under a capitalist social organization. Irrationality. Irrationality is something which is the idea that capitalism is in many ways irrational permeates the Manifesto. Marx and Engels say that capitalism is out of control. Indeed it is. It is not guided by any intelligible purpose or by any real means of control. Moreover, we find that capitalist development today, as then, is often inconsistent with very important human needs and even possibly with the survival of humanity as a species on this globe. Alienation. Capitalism is destructive to most forms of human community, including the family. the manifesto has numerous remarks about how destructive capitalism is to community and to the family. Capitalism makes it difficult for human beings to form any durable sense of personal identity, in large measure because the work which they do under capitalism is not meaningful, and work has always been a major source of personal identity. Work is done solely for the purpose of the material reward which it brings in, not because it has any kind of internal meaning, and this has deep consequences for the person's sense of personal identity. Another idea which I think is very important in the manifesto and is still very true today, is that a principal source of structural change in society is the struggle between social classes. This idea, which is emphasized throughout the manifesto, is still very much in effect today, although I think the class struggle is a great deal more complex today than it is suggested by the manifesto. But the insight that class struggle is the basic dynamo which forces structural change in society is very real today, and is one of the reasons why that manifesto has such a modern ring, despite the fact that it's 150 years old. David, you want to make some comments about any of that?
Yes, I'd like to turn a little bit in another direction and look at the meanings of the words like socialism and communism, which are put forward as labels for the society that will, in the view of the writers of the manifesto, inevitably succeed capitalism. When capitalism has built a grand enough surplus, and that's a necessary condition, then socialism becomes possible. Socialism being the social ownership of, in Marx's language, of the means of production, the dissipation of private ownership into quite other forms of social control, and therefore the abolition of the strong contrast between the capitalists and the workers. When Marx and Engels were writing this, there were many people in Europe who already called themselves socialists, who were, in a sense, bent on the same, toward the same goal that Marx and Engels were, but they did not regard the working class as being a particular means of this transformation. They were mostly, in Marx's rather scornful language, they were the bourgeoisie who wanted out from they were the middle class, who wanted out from the process of capital accumulation, but thought of themselves as the true inheritors of the future. Communism, by contrast, was of course a way of thinking that put the working class, the vast majority of society, in control. But the word communism, in Marx's development of it, meant more than socialism, meant more than the social ownership of the means of production and so on. It meant also eventually the abolition of the very process of exchange of goods, of markets, of money as the medium of exchange between what people produced and what they consumed. And this ideal of Marx, a future society in which the relation between human beings was no longer a relation mediated by money, but was simply a human relationship between them. And this notion of a society which has abolished all money exchanges among commodities and so on is, I've always thought, a genuinely utopian notion that's not justified by Marx's own economic analysis or by anything else that he can bring up from the study of history. But be that as it may, when the Russians, when Lenin and others decided that they were going to have socialism in that one country, they violated one of Marx's basic principles, which was that you could only have a genuinely socialistic society after there was worldwide sufficiency in the product of capitalist production. And they instead asserted that they were going to do this in just that one country, which was still a rather feudal country, not even a very capitalistic country. And I think history shows that communism in the Soviet Union suffered all the way along from the fact that it had to compete with capitalism in its economic and technological growth, and in a sense became super capitalistic. Its growth rate had to exceed the growth of capital elsewhere, because they didn't have it to start with. And I think that fact is one of the very powerful facts today in our very recent retrospect that makes the word communism look suspicious. It makes it have a kind of slant, a kind of meaning that it did not have at all in the time of Marx and Engels.
David, let me ask you a question about that, because it seems to me that as an ideal to be approached, not in one fell swoop, but in a series of stages, I wonder whether the communist ideal is as unrealistic as you make it sound, because it seems to me that even in capitalist societies, certain areas of production are socially distributed. Education is socially distributed, parks and recreation facilities to some extent are. In some capitalist societies, health facilities are. Is it unreasonable to think that more and more realms of human activity could be taken out of market relations and be distributed according to need?
Well, I don't claim to be a seer of the future, but I think there are many aspects of any productive system which involve what Marx called input-output relations, in which certain commodities come to a certain place and are consumed in the production of other commodities, which food comes to certain places and consumed by human beings who do labor. None of that is going to be abolished. None of that is going to be transcended. And how that process is mediated, how you know that the vegetables grown in one place are going to be distributed in a certain pattern, is mediated by some kind of exchange mechanism in which what is produced in one region in some sense matches what it consumes. These are technical problems, but I don't think they can just be wished away. Of course, what you say is true. Many things can be distributed publicly because they're not, in a sense, parks are not consumed. Vegetables are. Many things can become socialized, and that step in that direction, I think, is potentially always to the good. But I don't believe that there is any future human society that can abolish the fact that the relations between human beings in some respects are mediated by something like money or something like some equivalent.
You know, one of the things that you said about money kind of struck me, that the idea of moving to a moneyless society can only be appealing to people who don't have money. I mean, as you're saying it,
I agree with you about that,
wow,
certainly, yes.
This is just the greatest thing ever.
Well, let me give an alternative to that. If you look at the economy of countries in England, you find that for some country, perhaps Sweden, perhaps I think also maybe oddly enough Italy, about 65 or 70% of personal income comes from sources other than their labor. In other words, they're already quasi-socialistic. That percentage has been increasing in Europe slowly over the years. In the United States, the corresponding percentage has been going down. So we are on a different track from Western Europe. But if you see that percentage increasing in the world generally, this is a kind of gradual transition to something that you could properly call socialism. Medical services are free. We can't afford medical services ourselves anymore. They become public. They're mediated by money, but it's public money and not just private money. Many other things, we are gradually accustoming ourselves to the fact that many things are not bought by individuals out of the wages that they earn. But that is a slow process, much resisted by the right wing politically, and I think an inevitable process in the long run, whether after tragic troubles in our world or as a result of smooth, ongoing, gradual processes, I have no way of saying.
And of course, that's part of that process of class struggle that they were talking about.
Yes.
Which brings me to something that you said, Tom, about the contemporary relevance of that. And it strikes me that's interesting today. I recall entering college in the mid-'80s myself, and at that time, you weren't allowed to talk about class. But something happened in the intervening 10, 15 years, and the word class has re-entered academic discourse, as they say.
Well, I, as a sociologist, have been interested in class for as long as I have been a sociologist. I think it's absolutely fundamental for understanding society and the way in which society develops over time. Um, Intellectual fashions change. I think during the 50s, it was really difficult to be an intellectual, an honest intellectual, because certain kinds of views were so intensely prescribed. And I think that one of the great achievements of the 60s was to open up a political discussion and political thought in a way which was not possible when I went to college in the 50s. I don't think a reasonable analysis of human society from any perspective, whether it's the right or left, is possible without the use of the concept of social class. And that leads me actually to a reflection on something which David said. That is, although I agree with him that it's unlikely that markets could be completely abolished in human societies, and I'm not even completely convinced it's entirely desirable, I also think that if you have greater equality than is typical of a capitalist society, then the existence of markets isn't such a great problem.
Right, I'd agree with that completely.
The existence of markets becomes a great problem when there's so much inequality in society, so some people are not able to be consumers in a market system. I'd like to say a few things, I think perhaps one at a time, about what I think is wrong with the Manifesto. For although I admire it a great deal, I think it's important that we recognize what its limitations are and the way which we need to go beyond the thinking which is present in the Manifesto. I think one thing which I'd like to say that is wrong with the Manifesto is that I think it is wrong about important aspects of the working class, which we can now see 150 years later. First of all, the industrial working class, which is the kind of working class which Marx is talking about in the Manifesto, never became a majority in any society which we have any record of. It remained a substantial minority in many cases, but not a majority ever. And I think it's also fair to say that in the mature capitalist societies, it's not the case that the material condition of the working class deteriorated over a long period of time. By and large, the pattern is that the working class was able, through its own struggle, but within a capitalist society, to increase its level of consumption and the security of its existence. So I think those are two important ways in which the Manifesto is not right. I think, furthermore, the working class did not have an inherent tendency to acquire revolutionary consciousness. Marx kind of assumes that the working class will, through its own efforts and through its own activities, its own politicization, will become automatically revolutionary. I think that's not the case. Even when the working class became politically conscious, it usually developed a reformist kind of social consciousness, and a consciousness for trying to reform capitalism rather than trying to overturn it. And also, I think it unfortunately is not true that the national gender and race divisions remained unimportant to the working class. National divisions remained extremely important in the working class. They were willing to fight wars for their nations, killing each other on many occasions since 1848. And unfortunately, in our own society and others as well, gender and race divisions remain very important divisions and difficult to overcome divisions within the working class. So I think in those ways, Marx was not really correct in the Manifesto about the working class.
I think you're quite right about that. However, one must recognize that there's a substitute for talking about classes that goes with the discussion of classes, which is the pattern of wealth and income distribution in society. And that distribution, when you look at it, gives a rather different picture from just saying that the working class is better off, which is generally true. I think people who had to live in the great anonymous sludge of early 19th century society were very poorly off compared to most people now. But we do have not a large percentage, but a large number of human beings in our society and all over the rich world who live in conditions of pretty extreme poverty. They are not employed, and they're not counted among the employables. Therefore, they don't. When we say the unemployment rate is down, we don't count those people at all. This income distribution picture has to be looked at along with the general amelioration of what's called the working class. Also, of course, the nature of the jobs that are available now has changed a great deal. There are many fewer straightforward factory jobs and many more jobs that require a certain amount of academic education.
Actually, I should pause just a moment here to remind listeners that they're listening to Hemispheres. Professor David Hawkins, retired from philosophy, and Professor Tom Mayer of sociology, both from the University of Colorado. And Tom, the point you're making about what Marx was anticipating 150 years ago, I mean, it appears on the surface to be true and obvious, but it seems interesting to me that, I think it was last year the Children's Defense Fund released this, real scathing report on the state of the nation's children and pointed out that real wages for working people have been declining for the last 20 years in this country. So it seems sort of interesting that we're, approaching the millennium, and some of the things that he was talking about, I think some of the things that you're pointing out as being, not quite living up to their expectations in the beginning are actually more true today.
Well, I hardly want to give any kind of an apology for capitalism, and I agree with David's remarks that there are other ways of looking at the distribution of wealth and income in capitalist society. And I think the basic pattern has been a long-term amelioration connected with short-term fluctuations in the income and well-being of the working class. I offered these comments as partial explanation of why the revolutionary expectations, which are very prominent in the manifesto, have not come to bear, which I think is important for us to understand, because we need to have realistic programs and realistic approaches for trying to transform capitalist society. Which leads me to a second way which I think the manifesto is mistaken. That it seems to me that it's mistaken about the timetable of capitalist development. 1848 was really a very early date in the history of capitalist development.
Yes, indeed. It was only about 50 or 75 years old then.
Especially the history of industrial capitalism.
Of industrial, that's right.
And capitalist social relations at that time had only permeated a small part of the world and were not politically firmly in the saddle in almost any single society. So in a way, Marx is writing as if he's talking about a mature state of capitalism when he's actually facing a capitalist society which is in its very early states of development. And part of what that means is that capitalism had only started at that point to develop the productive powers of which it was capable. And even today, 150 years later, I think it's quite clear that the productive power of capitalism shows no indication of being exhausted. And one important idea which I think Marx developed, not so much in the manifesto, but later, was that a form of social organization is unlikely to be overturned permanently until the productive powers of which it's capable have been exhausted. And in fact, I think it's very clear that the productive powers of capitalism have not been exhausted, even today. I think it also seems to me that the economic crises experienced by by early industrial capitalism, although they're very painful, were quite unlikely to be fatal to the capitalist system. Marx talked about overproduction in particular, and that was, of course, a very ironic and hard to comprehend form of crises, because the previous economic system has suffered from crises of underproduction, of not being able to satisfy the needs, and here was the existence side by side of unsaleable goods and people with human needs. It's a very ironic and a very bitter form of contradiction, but not one in the conditions of 1848 likely to be fatal to the capitalist system.
I think, okay, but I'd like to come back to the business of the distribution of wealth, because if you look at, I believe I'm correct in this, if you look at American income statistics, you find that from about the 1960s, middle 60s, say, there has been a slow average decline in what you can measure as the hourly wage. This is taking all incomes and reducing them to the form of an hourly wage for the sake of uniformity in argument. That process has been accompanied with an increasing need in households for an increasing number of hours of labor per month, per year, frequently by both a husband and wife, which then leads to the problems, all the very vexed problems of child care that we mentioned before. And this is a potential crisis in the disproportion of income, not in the absolute level, but in the disproportion of income, in which those who work for wages get proportionately less and less in terms of the household and educational and other expenses which they face. The fact that more women are working is perhaps in part a reflection of the fact of women's liberation, but behind that is a very, very real economic fact, which is that poverty threatens people in many, many levels of our society if there is only one bread earner in that society. This is, and now you look at the disproportion in annual incomes between householders of this kind and the owners of various well-known large corporations, and that disproportion has been growing. This is not a great achievement.
Well, I completely agree with you, David. But, you know, the manifesto is about the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. And I'm interested in my comments here upon what makes that possible or what does not make it possible. We can point to all kinds of problems which capitalism has, very bad problems, and will continue to have. But the issue which interests me is what conditions make possible the revolutionary overturn of capitalism. And I doubt very much like that the problems which you're talking about are in that particular order.
Oh, I agree with you completely. I don't see any revolutions in the offing, but I do see an increasing crisis developing, which may be met in many other ways besides revolution. In fact, I don't see how revolution can meet this crisis. But the crisis is a crisis of a genuine crisis of capitalism, namely that it's decreasing dependence upon hourly labor and its increasing use of stored capital, and its constant search for labor eliminating, I don't call them labor saving, but labor eliminating technology. Look at the computer. Look at what we're doing right now. The radio and such things. The means of communication have gotten very much cheaper in objective terms. The means of the use of the computer in factories eliminates live labor. It employs further live labor, but the proportions are not the same. We're going to be faced increasingly with new technologies that reduce the system's dependence upon human labor. And that is going to lead to inevitably to the need for other means of income coming to human beings. This is not in the manifesto, I readily agree.
Well, Tom, it strikes me that in a broad sense that the point is that Marx was anticipating that eventually capitalism would fail to meet the needs of people, and that when people realized that their needs weren't being met and weren't going to be met, that is when revolution occurs.
Well, I doubt very much whether the mere failure to meet human needs, which I think has been almost the universal characteristic of economic systems since the beginning of time, would be a sufficient condition for the overturn of capitalism or for social revolution. I think there are very particular reasons why Marx believed the kind of crises which he thought capitalism had would lead to the overturn of that system, and it's far more, it seems to me, than merely the failure to meet needs, which it didn't do then, it doesn't do now, and it hasn't done at any intervening time, if we look at any reasonably developed sense of what human needs might consist of. I would like to mention another area which I think the manifesto is mistaken. Now, I say this again as someone who has been deeply influenced by the manifesto, regards it as one of the great documents, but it's partly because I have very high expectations of what it should be and what a Marxist analysis should make it, that I want to be as clear as I can about what I think some of the shortcomings are. And that I think if you read the manifesto today, it's somewhat mistaken about the social and political flexibility of capitalist society. I think capitalism could extend political democracy and civil liberties to the whole of society to a far greater extent than one would get the impression from reading the manifesto. The fact that we're having this discussion here in the context of a capitalist society is perhaps indicative of that, so though not in my mind any justification for the capitalist system as a whole. Capitalism could, in fact, establish a graduated income tax and provide free public education for virtually everyone, at least to a certain level. It could tolerate an independent labor movement and could, in varying degrees, provide welfare benefits for a significant level of the population. This doesn't mean that capitalism is a good system. I certainly don't think it is. I certainly think we could do better. But at the same time, I think it is indicative that it has a great deal more social and political flexibility and a great deal more historical durability than, in fact, one would think from reading the manifesto, even though the manifesto's critique of capitalist society remain, in my mind, very much on target.
You know, I'm the political scientist Michael Parenti, who I might, as a little commercial, mention that we'll be interviewing on Hemispheres
on will you? Good.
June 2nd, has a line that he uses occasionally in public speaking, which is that the ruling class of any society, this society included, only wants one thing, and that's everything. And I think that's actually what Marx was talking about with why capitalism would have to would fail in these crises, was not because resources could not be distributed in a way that took care of people, but because they won't be and aren't distributed in a way. Now, obviously, the activity on the part of labor and labor unions, particularly at the turn of the century, forced certain compromises. In the crisis of the 1930s, forced more compromises, and I think the Cold War also forced a great many compromises. But now, we're entering this period where the Cold War is over and labor has been on a retreat for so long that it's hard to tell where it's going to go from here. And so the capitalist class gets greedier and greedier, and that only brings the crisis closer and closer.
Well, I myself, and I guess I'm doubtful myself whether or not capitalism will be overturned as a result of a crisis in its own midst. It seems to me that capitalism will be overturned when a coalition which is opposed to capitalism acquires enough power in order to overturn it and to establish a different kind of social system. The issue seems to me power rather than a crisis, and I think it's somewhat mistaken for the left to focus so much upon a crisis. I think that's perhaps a model of the 30s, which has been given greater credibility than in fact it should happen. I think I fully agree with Marx that capitalism is not a permanent system, and it will be ultimately transformed into something hopefully much better. That will happen, though, it seems to me, not as a result of its breakdown or of its crisis, but because a coalition with different expectations, needs which aren't being satisfied, perhaps, comes into power and and has a vision about how to transform that society and acts upon that vision. The issue, I think, is power rather than crisis, and I think perhaps looking at that in that way would alter some of the pessimism which the left feels today as a result of the collapse of the socialist experiment, which was certainly the greatest effort to transform society that human civilization has ever seen. Its collapse is a deeply depressing event for the left. It would only but I think perhaps we could give it a different kind of meaning if we think about it differently.
Well, I would like to add a note to that. I think that collapse of the Soviet Union was not just a collapse of socialism. It was a collapse of an economic system that tried to outdo the capitalist system in its accumulation of capital, and as a result produced vast ranges of destructive damage to its own country and to the world. But apart from that, it seems to me the notion of revolution, as it was formulated 150 years ago, is now rather what you'd call an abstraction. I don't believe that I can't understand in this planet the occurrence of a revolution in the sense in which early communism hoped to see one. But I do think that we face alternatives of a very real kind, and I can go back to World War II, to the difference in let's say 1934 between the coming to power of Adolf Hitler and what was called National Socialism, and which our former President George Norland referred to as the religion of lost souls, the Nazi system in Germany, with its destruction of so many parts of what had come to be regarded as civilized human society.
Well,
on the other hand,
we might mention briefly that George Norland was a president of the University
I meant to,
of Colorado.
I meant
very popular president.
Very popular,
what,
and
5 decades ago?
A man of great eloquence. But at the same time, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States, and the United States, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, moved distinctively to the left, including a great deal of support for organized labor and so on, with many little beginnings of what could be regarded as a socialist economy. In any case, these two countries went in very diametrically opposite directions, and we have today the same dual potentialities in all of our societies. We have the possibility of ultra-right-wing dominance, and which could be very destructive. We also have the possibility of gradual development toward a more socialistic economy, if you want to use the term. I think the notion of revolution is an oversimplification in our world.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that one of the main ideas of the manifesto is that a qualitatively better society is possible than capitalist society. And I think that is a sense which I hope we can have again today, because I think it's even more true, far more true today, than a qualitatively better society, a society with less inequality, a society more rational in its relationship to human needs and to the environment and to international conflict, a society which does not destroy community is indeed possible. And that I think that if people had that sense, and as I think intellectuals and educated people ought to have that sense, that we are not permanently stuck with a system like the system we have now, and that the consumption is not the end-all of human existence, and that a system which justifies itself as a result of consumption is severely wanting in terms of most of human objectives. If we could have that sense, then I think it would be possible to reconstitute in rather short order a strong movement to transform the capitalist system we have into something which is far better and which is historically possible today in a way which is far more real than it was in 1848.
Tom, I before the show gets away from us completely, I did want to ask one particular, professional question, as a sociologist. Mm-hmm. What do you think it means that Verso would choose to republish the Communist Manifesto here on its 150th anniversary,
yes,
and not only to just publish it, but to do? I'm holding it in my hands, looking at it. It's a beautiful book, with stylish cover and of course very much red on the inside. What does it mean?
Well, first of all, Verso is a left-wing publishing house. It's connected with the New Left Review. It publishes many left-wing things, and so it's of course not surprising that it would publish the Communist Manifesto. But I think that it recognizes the point that the Communist Manifesto remains a penetrating critique of capitalist society, a penetrating statement that a better society is in fact possible, and a penetrating identification of what the faults of capitalist society are, which remain very much the faults of capitalist society today 150 years later. It's an eloquent, beautifully written document which can inspire by its literary power and by its concision and sharpness of phrase people today, just as it did 150 years earlier. I think it's this recognition which causes them to want to put the Communist Manifesto in the hands of many more people who can perhaps approach it with the awareness of the problems which our own society faces.
And what does it mean that some of the nation's largest bookstores, Borders Books and what's the other one? I'm forgetting the name of. The local Barnes and Noble. We're going to carry it and publicize it in a big way. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it means that we're recovering from the false identification of socialism with the Soviet Union, with the history of the Soviet Union, which we suffered anti-communism. Remember this very well for 50 years or more. In fact, we suffered it since 1917, when people in Russia decided to call themselves communists and adopted the particular kind of economic platform that they adopted. And remember that we had in our midst, not too long ago, witch hunts tracking down people on the basis that they might possibly, in some context, consider themselves to be communists. That's a recent thing. And to quote George Norland again, on our library is a statement of his that he who knows only his own generation remains always a child. A lot of people today are already growing up without that awareness of that history.
I agree with David, but I also believe that it indicates that major capitalist enterprises like Borders and Barnes & Noble are always looking for ways to make a profit.
Oh, of course.
And they recognize that even though this is an ideological anathema in terms of its content, in terms of its profit-making capacity, it's quite substantial. And that as long as people are wanting to read anti-capitalist tracts, the capitalist system would like to make a profit of them doing so.
American publishers have often been like this. English publishers have been a bit more conservative. I have an old friend who was a Quaker who couldn't get some of his stuff published in England. He had to bring it over to the United States.
Huh. And, I think, I forget where it was, but Marx had a remark that the capitalists would sell us the rope with which to hang them.
Sure.
And perhaps that is the Communist Manifesto.
Well, a tiny part of it.
In Borders' books.
Well, the Communist Manifesto is certainly the most powerful and widely read document of anti-capitalist literature ever written, and it's probably the most powerful call to arms of any sort ever written. And every educated person should be able to have read it and understand its contents. I must say I have been very surprised how few people really are very familiar with the contents of the Communist Manifesto, and that includes people on the left.
Which probably goes back to what David was saying earlier too, that it was there was a lot of fear around having this kind of book and
oh, yes.
Reading that. You certainly wouldn't want to read that in public in 1958.
It's true, but I also think it indicates a certain intellectual laziness upon on the part of people on the left. I think that in my view, that people on the left need to be more equipped intellectually and more able to understand the arguments of both the capitalists and the anti-capitalists than others. But in many cases, I think they were not up to the task. And I think that a new generation of the left, I would hope, to be more intellectually acute and more and have higher standards for themselves than perhaps some of the previous generations of the left have had.
I'd like to come back to one other virtue of the manifesto, and that is it's strong, the fact that the authors, because Engels was involved in this too, really in a sense had great admiration for capitalism and saw its development, its continued development, as a precondition for the coming of a different kind of society.
A necessary precondition.
Necessary
right.
precondition because a kind of anything properly called socialism will depend upon the productivity of a system, a kind of productivity which primitive societies or medieval societies simply did not have. And there must be that capacity for surplus production before any genuinely socialistic economy can function. So this is not a replacement of something bad by something good. It's a replacement of something that becomes possible as a result of the development of capitalism.
Which I think is good reason to believe that the transformation of capitalist society is far more possible today than it was in 1848, because the material conditions for that transformation really do exist at present.
But don't forget that we're not looking at a good fraction of the planet which is still in the condition of extreme poverty.
True.
And that kind of society cannot, as it now stands, make that kind of transition. This is a much more complicated problem than simply talking about what we can do when we are the United States and parts of Europe.
It's interesting you're talking about the greater potential now. Here we are approaching the turn of a century, the big one, obviously, the turn of a millennium. And 100 years ago, it seemed like that transformation might actually have been fairly reasonable, 50 years after the writing of the manifesto. But thinking about the history of industrial action at the turn of the last century and the strength of the IWW, the cohesion that international labor had at that time that we have yet to recapture.
That's quite true. I think in that time, international labor meant very much, however, Europe and North America. When they talked about the internationals, the Second International, which was a powerful association of working people's parties, it was a association of parties from the European and the North American continents. Today, partly because capitalism is a genuinely world system in the way which it wasn't at an earlier stage, capitalism would need to be confronted on a worldwide basis, which I think is one reason why the point David makes is very important and a telling one.
Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for coming down to the studio and talking with us about these important issues in world history. Hour just seems to go by so quickly. My name's Richard Curtis. You've been listening to Hemispheres on KGNU, regular feature, Tuesdays 6 to 7. I've been speaking with Professor David Hawkins of philosophy and Professor Tom Mayer of sociology. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, David.
And coming up next, we have Corriente, and once again, a little reminder about a special upcoming show June 2nd with Michael Parenti. We'll continue with some of these discussions and a little more analysis of global politics.